Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah thumma ma ba'd. In this session, which is a continuation in the Fiqh of Da'wah series, we want to talk about a brief point and to guide and inform our understanding of Da'wah. We want to look at the ayah of the Quran in which Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is saying, وَأَمَّرْهُمْ shura بَيْنَهُمْ, and their affair is conducted or guided by a collective decision-making process, or at least the exchange of ideas. And there's a number of ways to translate this ayat. We can translate it literally, or we can translate it in a more poetic form. The reality is that the Quran in itself, we have the principle in which is not translatable, because the Quran, by definition, is that which was revealed in Arabic to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam by way of Jibreel, and is contained in the Mus'haf, and it begins with Surah Al-Fatiha and ends with Surah Al-Nas. So Arabic is fundamentally a part of the Quran itself, but the meanings of the Quran can be communicated. And this is one of the reasons why Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayhi, it's attributed to him that he had allowed for the Salah to be prayed in Persian at one point in time. It is attributed to him. But the understanding there is that what we're aiming at is what? The meaning of the Quran. The meaning of the Quran. So at a basic level, the meaning of the Quran can be what? Grasped according to this reality, which we call translation. But in keeping with the principles of Islamic sciences, what we attribute to be Quran is that which has to meet the conditions laid out in the definition that was just put forth. وَأَمَّرْهُمْ shura بَيْنَهُمْ. The reality of the ayat teaches us then in Fiqh of Da'wah that as a collective body, as a group of believers, if we take on the Qur'anic characteristics, if we take on the sifat that the Quran is instructing us to take on, by encouraging us, by teaching us what are the qualities of the believers, then this quality is very important, that we conduct our affairs at least by mutual consultation, right? Mutual consultation. So what we see then is that in our understanding of da'wah, more often than not, those who engage in da'wah do not collectively convene to talk about an approach which should be taken. Now, we know that some people in their circles, they may do this. But what we find is still that da'wah is surrounded around personages, personalities. So that personality will define the shape and character of da'wah, although they themselves will claim to have legitimacy or authority from the scholars that they have studied from, or from their degrees, or however it is that they come to authenticate their position as a leader in the community. That's not the subject or the focus of this reflection. But what is the focus of this reflection is that an understanding of da'wah that's predicated and based upon this ayah of the Quran. How would that look like? How would that look like? That is a matter which will need a discussion which is more developed and carried out, and ironically it would need a group discussion if we want to talk about implementing the reality of this ayah in da'wah itself. Otherwise we go back to the same point, that you have an individual characterizing what da'wah should be, and there's no problem with that. But how can we move to implement this ayah in da'wah? That's the question. So we have this issue of vision development as far as da'wah is concerned. What is the characterization of da'wah. And this characterization of da'wah, depending upon whether it's collective or individual in its development initially, will mean that a practice will be based on that vision, right? Because people usually move out of their ideas, or they move out of what they feel, and what they feel usually is informed by something that they find sensible. Something that they find sensible. So we want to move beyond the issue of individual effort, right? Individual effort is something we should continue to do. We should continue to develop ourselves. We should continue to understand the contours of da'wah, the parameters of da'wah, the conditions of da'wah, the approaches of da'wah, the leniency that we have in developing something, and the strictures that we have in prohibiting something as far as da'wah is concerned, by referring to the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as a base by which to understand, and then moving from the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad, once we formulate our thinking and our taste for what da'wah is, to understanding the Quran in light of the seerah. And this is something that has been mentioned many times. But to move beyond the individual development towards a collective effort, right? The individual development of self and da'wah, beyond the individual effort to a collective effort, it takes a coalition of the willing, so to speak. And this is where we have to challenge those who are engaging in da'wah to be able to come together on a platform which will allow them to collectively formulate what da'wah will look like if it is operationalized by a group who represent the leadership of the community, which further represents the community. So the community has to want that. The community has to want it at the collective level of a city, at the collective level of a town, at the collective level, at the national level. So the community itself of believers has to want that at whatever level that community is defined at. But one way that we can begin to achieve this reality is by moving the family into the mode of shura and imbibing the spirit of da'wah within a family. Right? If at the end of the day there's no one to cooperate with, if at the end of the day there's no community to engage, then that community that we still have and that remains, it may not be that community that we think of in the larger sense, but that community that we think of in the lesser sense, which is the family, right? And the reason why I'm using the words in these ways, community, and kind of manipulating the words, is so that we expand our understanding that community doesn't necessarily mean, a masjid and people living around the masjid and so on and so forth, because for many of us that's not a reality. So then we can begin the process of moving to develop a vision for da'wah if we, as families, adopt this reality in whatever context we live. As families, we have an understanding of what da'wah is. And in this way, we can begin to implement the ayah of the Quran, وَأَمْرُهُمْ shura بَيْنَهُمْ, that their affairs are conducted by mutual consultation. We can begin to implement this ayah of the Quran at least at the level of the family, and in this particular instance, the issue that we will be trying to apply the ayat of the Quran to is that of da'wah. So we want to look at da'wah and how can we practice it in a collective sense. And the beginning point possibly is to begin as families to look at this reality of what is da'wah and how can we engage da'wah. A higher sense will be that the leadership of a city will come together and engage what da'wah looks like at the level of the city, at the level of that community. So then you have multiple levels of community life being engaged. And the reality is that when we look in the history of fiqh to the time of what they call yani Asr al-Buyut, Asr al-Buyut, and we know a famous scholar who came from this time period, and his name is Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah and his father and his grandfather and so on and so forth, they came from what they call the household period, in which households were known to be the preservers and purveyors of knowledge. Right. So you have a whole household and a whole family that they're all known to be people of knowledge. So these families then carry the da'wah and carry the deen and carry the ilm. And this is aside from having other institutions, right? But this is something that we can imitate or something that we can take from our tradition. That the development of families in this light, something which contributes to the ummah. So one way, again, of implementing the Quran, when we look into history, and in particularly engaging da'wah, is by looking at how the Quran can relate to the issue of da'wah and then looking at how we can practice it. And here we're talking about collective effort, collective discussion, collective activity. So how can we engage that in the context of brokenness? We begin with the family. We begin with the family. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين والحمد لله رب العالمين والحمد لله رب العالمين.